Hey friends, I'm Scott Hanselman. This isn't actually a tutorial video. This is raw, unedited footage from a recent user group that I did at the Omaha Azure User Group in Omaha, Nebraska. We did it remotely over Teams. The quality might not be 100% awesome, but the content I think is. There was a lot of great comments from the audience that moved the talk forward. It's not a tutorial, it's a deep technical conversation about how Windows thinks about terminals and consoles and Linux, but I hope you enjoy it. If you're looking for shorter tutorials, I would encourage you to check out the other videos on my channel. Of course, you don't have to watch them all, so if this one doesn't add value, I hope you stick around and check out one of the other videos. Thanks.
All right, over to you, Scott.
All right, woo! Thank you, sir. Thanks, everybody. Cool. Hey, I'm Scott Hanselman, and I've done YouTubes about the topic of WSL and the Windows subsystem for Linux before, but I want to encourage you to remember that this is not a YouTube. This is a real live me. So I don't want to just talk where like I give a talk and you're like, you need to talk back. I need you to chat with me. If you have a good question and you're nice, you can interrupt and speak up and say, hey, hang on, you didn't go into enough technical detail there. Or wait, that wasn't clear. And then we'll have a much more fun and much more interesting technical meeting if y'all would interrupt me appropriately, and we'll have a good time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got 3 screens here, so you may see my head moving back and forth. You can also make that screen, I think, with Teams full screen if you hit F11 in your browser. And what I'm going to be talking about is the Windows subsystem for Linux. It's a thing that I like very much. But in order to talk about that, I need to talk about the terminal. And in order to talk about that, I need to talk about the history of terminals on Windows. And I actually have a blog post around this concept because there is a big difference, my friends, between a console, a terminal, and a shell. And people mix and match those words, console, terminal, and shell, a lot. And they'll say things like, oh, Windows Terminal came out, but I use Cygwin. Or, oh, I want to use Ubuntu, but I hate the Windows Terminal. Or I use Xterm, and there's no Xterm on Windows. And they mix their words up a little bit. So here's a little bit of unnecessary Windows history for you to understand what's going on and why we got where we got. So if I go to the Start menu and I run cmd.exe, you get this. This is basically DOS, but not DOS. It's not really DOS, but it looks and feels like DOS because you can type dir and things like that. Okay, it's not PowerShell, it's not Bash. And I think people would agree that it kind of sucks. So that's not really DOS. If I go back to the Start menu and I type in Windows PowerShell, I usually get this blue thing. And PowerShell has a good reputation amongst Windows people, but a lot of Linux people don't like it because it's weird and it's confusing. And while you can type dir, and while you can, in fact, also type ls, each of those things when you type dir and ls are actually aliases for other things. So when you type ls, you're not really getting a list as you would on Bash. And when you type dir, you're in fact aliasing to a PowerShell-ism, which is called get child item. And PowerShell is both a shell and a scripting language. So that's a thing. So we'll put that over there. Then when you install Git on Windows, you get a thing called Git Bash. And that looks like this. And you can type ls and you can feel good about yourself. And you can type vim. And then if you get lost, you just close the window because no one knows how to run or stop vim. So Git Bash looks and feels and smells like Linux, but I can't run top and I can't run LSB release. It's not really Linux. So that's a thing, and that's interesting. Then I've got a dealie called Cygwin, and Cygwin looks and smells like Linux, but it ain't. It's actually GNU utilities recompiled using Win32, and we'll talk about that. And here I am on Windows, and I have run 1, 2, 3, 4 shells. How many terminals have I run here? How many terminal applications have I run? Well, I've run 2. because I'm going to move these over here. I'm going to move these over here. The thing that made strings and output strings, and I typed strings into, is a shell. The terminal is the thing that actually painted on the screen. It drew the chrome that is the terminal. It did not make the strings, it drew the strings. And I can prove that by going like this, and there's the properties of this console, and there's the properties of that console. So this console host is called con host, C-O-N host. So when you're running PowerShell or when you're running command or fake DOS, you know it's this old Windows 95 console thing because you recognize this properties dialog. Okay? And one of the dirty little secrets about the nightmare fuel that is old DOS on Windows is if I were going to go and type dir/s, which is going to run a / subdirectory sort here, subdirectory view, it's going to go, and it's going as fast as it can. Well, it turns out that's actually not very fast. Not only that, because of historical reasons, it's synchronous. It can actually only output to the screen as fast as the screen can accept output. So it actually pauses and slows down the process. In fact, people who have done really fast builds on Windows will know this horrible trick that if you make it paint less, it goes faster. That is a fundamental flaw in Windows and how they made the console. In fact, the fastest a console can run is when it is minimized. So that's bad. And that is because of historical designing of this older console. Again, not the shell. The shell is cmd.exe, which I can run. The shell is PowerShell, which I can run. Exit out, I'm in DOS. Exit out, I'm in another DOS. I can be over here in PowerShell, and I can type in command.exe, and now I'm in DOS. Exit out, I'm still there. People don't think about those things, and that's important because if I were to do something like that, like let me say if I say PowerShell, and then I say command, and then I say PowerShell, and I say command, I'm like 4 or 5 deep now. Well, let's now right-click on our task manager, and let's see what's going on. This probably won't work well because task manager sucks. But you can see here that the Windows command processor, which is in fact the console host, now has all these child things underneath it. And that's con host right there. That's the thing that painted the strings that were created by the shell. Savvy? Now, why are you telling me this, Scott? That's a good question. Because these fake Linuxes are not drawn by the con host. They are drawn by a thing called min_tty. And min_tty made these dialog boxes, and min_tty was effectively a vote of no confidence against the Windows console host. The Windows console host sucks so bad, historically, that people wrote their own. You'll notice if I go back to PowerShell, there's some bad stuff happening here. What's going on there? What's going on there? Well, there's missing fonts, there's missing glyphs, there's missing ligatures. It's not a sophisticated console. It doesn't support ANSI and high ASCII. It doesn't support glyphs. It is just generally problematic. So min_tty tries to solve that, and they wrote their own thing, and it's a lovely GNU utility, and it runs a shell called Cygwin. Cygwin is fake Linux, which is totally fine. I'm not disrespecting it by calling it fake Linux. It is. It is the GNU utilities recompiled on top of Win32. And min_tty is a replacement console for Windows. Okay. So, pause for effect. The Windows terminal is a newly rewritten, entirely open source, fresh new terminal from Microsoft that's up on GitHub. And it allows you to run n number of shells. Shells can be remotes, SSHs into other places. They can be PowerShell, fake DOS, Windows PowerShell or PowerShell Core. This one here is PowerShell Core, which is cross-platform, or Cygwin, which is the Win32 recompiled Linux binary sitting on top of a Windows kernel. Again, these are all things that make strings. While this is the terminal that paints those strings. So now if I do my dir/s, that's actually happening at like 500 frames a second. It's running in DirectX. It's as fast as a video game, and it is unaffected by a lot of the issues that are existed before, and it's totally asynchronous, which means it's happening as fast as possible, and it doesn't slow things down, even when I select text. The shell hasn't changed, but the terminal, the Chrome around it that paints it, has. Additionally, I have tabs. I can open different ones. Cygwin, which didn't even, which existed many years before that, doesn't even know it's painting underneath the Windows terminal. Why? It's not responsible for painting stuff, because terminals talk to a pseudo terminal using a very common architecture called conpty, and that allows us to send out strings with control features and colors and fonts, and then whatever terminal you want to use, you can use. And that's really useful because there's a really lovely, rich ecosystem of alternative terminals. I'm not trying to sell you anything because everything I'm selling you is free. This is the Terminus Terminal, another open source terminal. This one is, I believe, written in JavaScript. Another great one is called Hyper. And these are all terminals that have tabs that do different stuff. You'll notice that this one here is failing, but trying to output those glyphs that we saw were question marks and squares before. But we'll look at the Windows terminal, and we can see that, look, it is, in fact, doing complex glyphs. Why would I care about complex GIFs? Well, let's go over to my podcast website, and I've got this lovely pretty prompt, and you can go and learn more about that by going to hanselmanprettyprompt.com. Not really. You go and Google with Bing for Hanselman Pretty Prompt, and I've got a whole blog post about how to set this up. This is using a wonderful thing called Oh My Posh, and it's a PowerShell script. You can do this in any shell. There's Z shell and fish and bash and whatever. This is nice because it says I'm on the main line of Git, and I've got 2 items that have been added, 0 modified and 0 removed. Definitely a dirty branch. Go and pull, so I need to pull anything new. Nope, I'm up to date. I can go back up to another one, and we'll see that now I'm on a clean main. Okay. Works really great. Windows terminal is shiny. You can hit Alt-Enter and go full screen. You can control scroll for size. You can go, what's the word? Transparent. All kinds of cool stuff you can do. Cool. But so far, I haven't shown you anything Linuxy except for the fake Linuxes of the Cygwin universe. Again, not meaning to disrespect our friends at Cygwin, but let's talk about what that means to say fake Linux, and I'll use the greatest diagramming tool ever created, which is Paintbrush, because I don't actually have a license for an actual diagramming tool. Cool. So we have Windows. Look at that. What is amazing. And then he pulled out Paintbrush, and the whole thing went to hell. There is Windows, and here is my my terminal, which then fired off my my potential shell. And when the shell, let's say that is maybe that's PowerShell, and maybe we'll have another shell that'll be Cygwin, and that'll all run in the context of our terminal.
Scott, I don't mean to interrupt. Can you hear me?
Absolutely interrupt, and I appreciate you interrupting.
Cool. I just wanted to say that I've been in a lot of meetings where people have been diagramming on the fly. Usually it's like a combination of like presentation, like PowerPoint tooling and or Lucid chart. And I have to say this is probably the most effective and fastest. So I don't use a Windows machine anymore, so it's like I don't have this as readily available. But it's just speaking to my like childhood right now, seeing this screen, because I just remember doing so much creative work with Paint, as a young girl. So.
Well, that makes me very happy. I feel like I should bring out maybe like the spray paint.
I feel like this is a perfectly acceptable diagramming chart because you can do everything that you want in an easy and accessible way. Especially like it's particularly for Windows users. So this is great.
Rock on. Cool. Well, I appreciate that compliment. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's also because I'm fundamentally lazy and I need to work on my diagramming, but I like that. Yes, somehow it just works for me. Thank you. Cool. PowerShell and Cygwin are doing some stuff. Now, Cygwin, I said, is fake Linux. Why would I call it fake Linux? What a mean thing to say. Well, when you go and do something on Cygwin like ls, which is like list out some files in a directory, it needs to go and then list out some files in a directory. Well, it expects as a GNU user space utility, as a C utility that was compiled in the Unix context, to go and call Unix, what are called syscalls. It's going to go and call these syscalls and say, hey, enumerate the files, right? You know, gimme files in this dir. But of course, those system calls don't exist on Windows, so it would fail to do that. So instead, they recompile it, and they pound define their way to glory. If you've ever done C, you basically pound define Windows and pound define Linux. And in doing that, they've cross-compiled, and they've said, hey, if I'm running ls on Windows, that's cool in the gang. Let's go and have it call Windows APIs. So when you list out get files in directory from Cygwin, or you do it from PowerShell, it happens the same way. Cygwin is a collection of GNU utilities that have been recompiled to run on top of Windows. And that's a great thing because it allows people to go and feel comfortable. They can nest. But when they go PWD, they might find themselves over here in a thing called Sig drive, which is a mount point, and the actual Windows file system lives here. There's my desktop. Beep, boop, bop, boop. Come on, desktop. You can do it. There it is.
I have a question on this.
Yes,
so,
ma'am.
Like, this kind of feels like a very like old school, primitive style Dockerization, right? Like, I mean, Docker's just like a bunch of namespaces. I'm just curious, like, is that what's happening here?
So what's happening with Cygwin specifically is Linux heads who feel comfortable in Bash did not find satisfaction with the shells that were made available to them. So they cross-compiled the GNU user space stuff to give them a Bash-like experience on Windows. And I'm trying to explain that that is a lie. It ain't Linux. It just feels comfortable. It's like an IKEA showroom. And you can hang out there, but you start opening cabinets and stuff, and you realize it's not really Linux at all.
Yeah, because ultimately, like, the underlying API it's calling is, you know, PowerShell or whatever.
Or Windows kernel stuff.
Yeah, Windows kernel stuff. And so ultimately, it's like a syntactic sugar around, you know.
Well said. Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Thank you for that. Cygwin and things like it are syntactic sugar on top of Windows. So great point. Thank you for that. So syntactic sugar. Sugar is bad for you. Well, when you are a Windows person, you have this feeling where you'll go and Google for something. Install Redis. Hey, I love Windows. Windows is great. I'm a Windows user. I found a web page on how to install Redis. Cool. Hey, welcome. Let's install Redis. Okay, first go to your terminal. It should look like this. And then Windows users go, wah, wah, wah. And they go, hey, that sucks. Mine looks like that. Well, you're screwed. Use a real operating system, Microsoft, with a $sign. You suck. Okay. You can't install Redis using Cygwin, because the reality is it's not Linux, it's just syntactic sugar to Amal's point. So enter the topic of this actual conversation. Close, 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 close. This is great. I'm going to start using that in future talks. Okay.
You're welcome to beg, borrow, steal.
Love it.
That's what we do, right?
This is right. It's derivative works, I think is the term. So here, I just typed WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux on my machine, --list -v for verbose. And you'll notice here that I have 7 Linuxes, 1 running, but note this one here. That's weird. Alpine is version 1. What's that about? I'm going to type WSL -d, and I'm going to type in Alpine. and we'll type something in there. Is there anything right now? I have Vim and I have dir. What do I have in here? Do I have top? Okay. I am running top in Alpine on Windows. I want to point out also, to Amal's point, it's not a containerization in the sense it started in a second. Click, boom. There was no, I started a VM. It just went, it just ran as fast as anything. Let's go back to Taskman. Scroll. What's this? Well, if you're familiar with Linux using Alpine, Alpine calls everything BusyBox. That's the name of their processes. These are Windows processes. Windows processes are historically heavy. This is not a disrespect, but a simple statement of fact. To create a process on Windows, to fork a process on Windows is non-trivially expensive. While Linux people, maybe they are on our call with us today, know that forking a process in Linux is like breathing. You do a thing, you fork it, and you just make processes. On Windows, you have to make copies of environment variables and you have to bring window handles along for the ride. It's a whole thing. So when Windows Subsystem for Linux was designed, they said, if our process system on Windows is made for Windows, maybe forking dozens of processes all the time isn't going to be a good idea. So they invented a new kind of process in Windows called a Pico process. Pico process, tiny process. Now, we know how Cygwin works. Those are Linux processes, but look, they have Windows process IDs, Windows PIDs. It's really Linux. Those are the real, what are called ELF binaries, the real user mode binaries. Alpine does not know that we are not running Linux. It believes that it lives in a world where it is still the case that it is Linux. So here's Alpine down here, and we'll go and say Alpine. Except when we did Cygwin before, Cygwin literally and actually called the Windows APIs. Alpine does not in this case. It is a real Linux, and it is calling a system call. It is calling for a Linux kernel. That does not exist. So on WSL1, if you're familiar with Wine, W-I-N-E, on Linux, it's a way of getting Windows running on Linux without a virtual machine. WSL1 intercepts system calls to Linux, lies to them, and redirects to Windows. It thunks, T-H-U-N-K. It thunks over there. Cygwin, user mode compiled, knows that Windows exists. Alpine is now effectively lied to. This is super awesome, works really great, except it's somewhat slow because the file system is still using the Windows file system, and there's some layering issues that are a little bit confusing. People also said, well, I want to be able to run my own Windows kernel. I want to be able to run kernel drivers, do networking stuff. Like I want Linux. I don't want fake lied to Linux. Do you have a question, Amal?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Scott. So this is like fascinating. So you're saying that WSL1 is essentially this proxy layer. And like, as I'm sure you're probably very familiar with this since you've worked on operating systems, do you know that in browser land, like a lot of performance issues are from like converting strings to numbers and back again? Like,
yeah, it's all thunking.
Yeah,
exactly.
like yeah, all that thunking. So you're saying like, okay, it's slower. This is slower than the Cygwin model because of the thunking, right? Like the string conversion, like // like,
yeah. So
the hell
in
else,
the context
right?
of Cygwin, Cygwin is a native Windows app running natively on Windows. It's a comfort food. While Alpine are literal, unchanged ELF binaries being lied to, there is an overhead for that.
Okay.
To your point.
So I have a question on this. So essentially, I'm curious, like that Pico, that decision to kind of extend the Windows OS with support for these microprocesses called Pico Processes.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, like about these Pico Processes, like your analogy on like forking processes and creating child processes being like second nature in Linux land is like so accurate, right? Like ultimately, like you can be like, sub-process within sub-process within sub-process.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to make it lighter.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And so as long as you're managing your memory, like you can go as deep as you want, right?
Yep.
And so like your only constraint is like hardware and resources. And so and so I'm just curious, how are we getting around that? I mean, I feel like what was it like to architect this Pico process, and like what does Pico process like actually translate into in Windows land? Like, is there some like namespace that's like created where these processes are running inside of some like shared array buffer type thing? Like, I'm just curious. Like, I'm really curious how like it works under the hood. I don't know if that's like a huge divergence to your talk.
So two things. You and I can do a call later, and I'll introduce you to the architect of it on Twitter.
Okay, cool.
But I think it's worth not going too deep into that because it is now obsoleted, and WSL2 is the future, and I'll tell you why.
Oh, wow, that's really good to know. Thank you. Yeah.
So
I can parking lot it.
Yeah, that's cool. WSL1 existed for a year or two. It exists currently. I'm keeping one around, but there's so much wrong with this in that it is still a lie. And doing networking stuff or kernel driver stuff, like there's so many ways that this breaks down over time that it is not worth it. The first and most important one of why this breaks down over time is the file system. So if I make a little fake file system here, this is my little file system, aren't I special? Database thing, there's my file system. And what happens is, where is the Linux file system? Where is the ext4 file system? Well, it's sitting on NTFS. So file system access to the Linux file system is actually like 10 times slower than native with this technique, which is super bad because we write to what we think is the Linux file system, which then writes to the NTFS file system. And the problem is, one syscall in Linux land might map to 3, 4, 5, or even as many as 10 writes in NTFS because of fundamental philosophical architectural differences. NTFS has a huge amount of metadata, and if Alpine wants to go and do a write, and Linux assumes that a file system call it's nothing. It's picoseconds, it's milliseconds, it's nanoseconds. But on Windows, we just don't do those things. And now we're shoving things into a secondary file metadata slot. It's like, oh, wow, this thing on Linux did it in a loop tightly 1,000,000 times. And on Windows, that's 1 billion file system calls. npm install would be the classic example. I just wanted to go and install my node modules. And it could be, 15, 20 minutes. WSL1 broke down under the weight of its own success. So, but I'll happily plug you in with the people that made it. Enter WSL2. Notice that these have been converted. And it's interesting because converting a WSL installation on Windows is trivial. You literally just say set version. And the irony is what we do is we just tar it up, we zip it up, we swap the underneath, and then we unzip it. We just take your file system, which is really cool because you can, in fact, import and export your WSL file systems and share them. So I could basically tar up my file system, hand it to Amal. She could then unfold it onto her machine, and she's got my Linux. So it's a really nice, not quite a container, but a way of saying, here's my entire file system. Now, if I decided to go and say just WSL or type bash 1002, okay, let's exit out of there. 1000. So it's quite fast. We go back over here. We can see now that no one has been running Alpine for a while, so it fell asleep. It's stopped now. This one is now running. It's version 2. This is running using Hyper-V. Now, this is really important because there are folks on the call who know how Hyper-V works. And as engineers, it's kind of intuitive for us to want to say, oh, you're just doing this. And then you go and you minimize the work of 100 computer scientists working in concert over 3 years and say, oh, you're just doing a virtual machine. It's a little more complicated than that. So Hyper-V is the hypervisor, right, that Windows runs on, like Haxi is one that Intel makes, and VirtualBox has one, and VMware has one. Hyper-V is the Microsoft hypervisor. And Hyper-V is a Windows 10 Pro feature. That means you have to pay to do Hyper-V. Now, I and others at the Microsoft think that that's bad, and that's a little gatekeepy, because there's lots of students out there that run Windows 10 Home. But what is Hyper-V? Well, it's a hypervisor, which runs virtual machines, and it is a brand name for this kind of client thing. Notice when I open up Hyper-V here, I have no virtual machines. Virtual machines I think of as being big, heavy, scary things that you like fire up a machine within a machine. Here's a 30 gig VHD, virtual hard drive. I'm going to start this Hyper-V up, and you're looking at 90 seconds, 2 minutes to fire up a Hyper-V, and it comes up as a square within a square, and I'm running a virtual machine within a virtual machine, and it's a whole thing. That Hyper-V is used by developers, and it's very much a pro feature. With WSL 2, what we've done is we've separated the platform for hypervisor from Hyper-V, the product. So this is Hyper-V, the big run a virtual machine full screen thing. And down here, these platforms, the hypervisor platform, and this is huge, by the way, is available on Windows. See how awesome my mousing is? It's so epic. On Windows 10 Home. This was a huge win to get the bosses and the marketing and the people to get that to work. That means that students and anyone with a $200 laptop from Walmart can run the Windows subsystem for Linux. So you just turn on that, and you're all set. Okay?
Hey, Scott,
Then, go ahead.
what comes as part of that platform? I mean, what's the difference between Hyper-V and the platform?
That's a great question. The people who don't have Hyper-V don't get this manager, don't get the ability to run arbitrary virtual machines. They're not doing the pro Hyper-V stuff that Windows Server and devs expect to use. But they do get the ability to run Linux natively on Windows at scale. They can go to the store now, type Linux, and pick one of N number of Linuxes, all free, or they can go and make their own, compile their own Linux. They can trade them with their friends like Pokemon. You have a question, Amal?
Yeah, I think this is super cool. I'm whoever managed to do the internal advocacy on this, kudos. I really like this freemium model. I think it's respectful to the fact that good software should cost money because it costs money to make it, right? But at the same time, giving people the car, the chassis, maybe just not the shock absorbers and the leather seats, but they can still drive. I think that's great. That's a good compromise, I think. So
I'm glad.
Kudos to that, whoever helped make that change happen. I'm sure it's made a huge difference in accessibility for people who can't afford MacBooks, right? Which are the de facto dev tools. So
that is exactly what my goal was. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Tijan has his hand up.
Yes. So if I understand correctly, the Windows Hypervisor platform is available only to run WSL2, not WSL1, right?
It is. That's a great question. So his question is, the hypervisor platform is available for 2 and not 1. In fact, it is not needed for 1 because 1 never used it. To our original picture, this Pico process lie involves no hypervisor at all. So if you, for example, have an older PC that doesn't have the ability to even run Intel VT extensions or any hypervisor process instructions, you could still use WSL1 because it does not require a hypervisor. That is a great question.
Oh, that's great. So,
Awesome.
So even if you have a low-end computer, you can still run WSL1.
Exactly. Well said.
Thank you, Scott.
Good stuff. Okay, cool. So let's look at this. I'm going to go and sort by memory. And here, notice that my Linux virtual machine is using less memory than Microsoft Teams. There's no irony there, my friends. That VMM is what's called a utility virtual machine manager. You can think of it as a virtual machine, but remember when I made that whole little speech about why you shouldn't say just? Oh, it's just a virtual machine. Well, I like to say it's a utility virtual machine. When was the last time you saw a virtual machine start up in less than a second, right? When was the last time you saw someone go like this and open up Ubuntu, Alpine, another version of Ubuntu that's entirely different, W-Linux, and Kali Linux all up? Now I've got 5 different Linuxes all running on the same Windows machine. That doesn't happen. Tijan.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt again.
No, that's good questions.
Thank you. When you are switching between Linux editions, do you shut down the previous edition, or they are all running at the same time?
Lovely, lovely question, and I thank you for it.
Thank you.
All running because they haven't timed out yet. They are still running.
Okay.
And you can decide. You can keep them running in the background. You can set them as keeping alive. I think it's something like 5 minutes or some number of minutes. They'll eventually go to sleep. It's up to you. You can also individually terminate them and control them, or shut down the entire subsystem as well. You have control.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Zahir has a question.
Do they all run in their own virtual machine?
They all run within their own virtual machine context, but they all run within the larger context of this. They run in their own kernel space, but they run within this VMM utility runner. So right now I'm using a 0.5 gig to run them all. And then I can set what's called a I think it's WSL conf file. WSL conf, here it is, WSL.conf, where I can do things like this and say, like, where do they mount and how much memory do they use and how do they manage their networks? It's basically how do I want each of these to behave? Do I want them to use all of my RAM and my memory and things like that? You can decide on a system-by-system basis how you want that to happen. So here I could say, this WSL uses a custom kernel that I compiled myself, and I want to limit it to 4 gigs and only 2 of my 10 processors. Does that answer your questions here?
Perfect. Thanks, Scott.
Lovely. All the good questions, my friends. Now, this machine here that I have it's a pretty good machine, but it's not. This is a 4-year-old i9. This is not like the new hotness. It does have a lot of processors and a lot of memory, but I don't need those things to run what is effectively right now less than a 0.5 gig system. Sir, Tijan.
You showed the WSL.config file.
Yeah.
Does it mean that you can create multiple WSL profiles?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. So you can make as many as you want. And you can see here that I could actually copy one. So right now, if I say WSL-list-v, I could export this one and re-import it back to myself with a new name, making a copy of itself, and then treat it differently. So I could freeze it in amber, like a bug on Jurassic Park, and save it for later, trade it with my friends.
So Scott, could you maybe just briefly elaborate on some use cases for wanting to do that? I'm trying to kind of get my mental model here for why that's useful. I would imagine for things along CI environments and
I'll give you an example.
Blah blah blah.
So Tara Walker works at Microsoft on Azure IoT. And her job is to make it so people can set up a build environment so that they can easily and quickly run all the tools they want to go and run Azure IoT devices and stuff like that. And so she wanted to say, here's a tar file. Just download it, type one line and import it. And it's got the build essentials, the SDKs, it's pre-configured, and it is your personal, perfect little Linux machine that's lighter weight than a VM because it's just a couple of gig tar. That you just import and you're set up for a build system.
Yeah, that was my understanding. I think VM Lite is a good analogy for me to understand like why this is useful.
Right, but not a container.
But not a container. Yeah.
Exactly, because this has real. Well, like let's look at exactly. So if I go like this and I go htop, remember those 20 processors? They're all there. I have access to them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, I totally see how this is like a really interesting kind of vertical, like new vertical, right? That's like somewhere in between traditional VM and container, but like infinitely more useful than I think both to some degree.
Okay. So this is actually a good opportunity to blow your mind then. Okay. So here I'm in, what am I in? I'm going to shut, I got too many of these running now. I'm getting turned around. Let's just go back into Ubuntu and notice where I'm at. I'm on the Windows file system. So I've mounted it. Now, if I'm from here, and let's go to C, like we said, where we're at, users, Scott, desktop. I'm in Linux looking at the Windows file system. If I type notepad.exe, that is a Windows executable. And this is why this is not just a VM. I just ran a Windows executable from Linux because Linux failed to run it and Windows got the second chance.
That is so cool. So essentially, there's this like front end of the back end type infrastructure that's happening here, but there's safe defaults for fallbacks like that default to Windows essentially.
Right.
Like are the fallbacks configurable at all? Like, can you set up your own mapping?
Awesome question. So this path for things that got searched, the thing that allowed me to call Notepad, is actually an environment variable called WSL path, which is its own path, which says I want Windows in my path or I don't. And the fallback is crucial because you notice that I didn't just say Notepad. That would be exploitable. You had to add the exe to be explicit that you wanted Windows. And you had to say I want the WSL path. But then it allows you to do really crazy stuff. Watch this. This is ls, right? Okay. ls, pipe it to clip.exe. I have now piped Linux contents into the Windows clipboard.
This is absolutely mind blowing. I mean, it's kind of made Windows, for me anyway, Windows computers relevant for like primary software development as a primary software development tool.
So I love that.
I think yeah, because like for better or worse, I mean, Windows. I mean, for me, Microsoft, like there's still a beauty and an elegance to a Windows system, right?
Yeah.
I just think for me as an engineer, like there's a lot of frustration I have around like writing software on Windows,
Yeah, it sucks. So let me blow your mind a little bit more. Let's do this. Let's make a folder in my.
Oh yay! I get a folder.
You're a part of the thing now. Now notice the file system. This is Windows, and that's mounted. This is native and ext. What is it called? What is the file system thing? Is it DS? DF? DF. Is it DF-A? There we go. So here's all our file systems locally, right? Okay, cool. And you see that your C drive, your Windows stuff is all mounted. Okay, so Amal is down here. Now, we'll leave you there for just a second. We'll go back over here to there. I'm going to type explorer.exe dot for the current folder. That gets me here, right? C : desktop, right? Now, let's go back to the Amal folder, which is squarely and completely in the Linux file system. Unquestionably, we agree. It is opaque. Explorer.exe dot. Okay, let's back up and see how we did that. All of the Linuxes are running a Plan 9 server, which allows us to access them from Windows as if they were a network file share, except they're not. They're local to me. Cool?
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly still processing. No pun
Okay.
intended. No
Well,
pun intended. Like it's just
got-
this is a very awesome innovation.
Love it, love it. I've got even more. So check this out. So let's take a MALS folder, and I'm going to use .NET, but for the purposes of what we're doing, imagine if it's Go or it's Ruby or it doesn't matter. It could be whatever makes you happy. But I'm just using .NET because that's my jam. Okay. Make a new console app. This is a .NET that was installed on Linux. So if I say which .NET, it's in user bin. Cool. .NET run. Okay. Go and run that. There's hello world. How would I go and edit this now? Well, I could go Vim and do that. But I like Visual Studio Code. But Visual Studio Code is a Windows application. So what if I run code dot? Watch the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Visual Studio Code knows that it launched itself from a Linux file system. It split itself in half. And it is created inside of Linux.
I have a question on this, but I'm going to just queue it up.
Well, look, we're running half of Visual Studio Code in Linux and the other half in Windows.
So I have to ask you, like, so is this a Visual Studio Code feature, like that's like a fork, like, because ultimately, if I understand correctly, Visual Studio Code is an Electron app, right?
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and you haven't forked Electron; it's still like Electron.
No, there's nothing fancy going on here. This is not rocket surgery in any way. This is totally understandable. Nothing's hidden.
So how is it running half of its how are the threads split across these two different processes?
Okay, that's a great question. So let's think about the work that is required to paint this and manage this. This is all done locally. This is not a thin client. It's a chubby client at best. So the painting, the work, this is all running in the context of Windows. If I go and open that up, I can see Visual Studio Code is sitting right here. It's a Windows app. This is in every way a Windows application. Okay? But it has extensions. And extensions inside of Visual Studio are usually installed locally, and I have 35 of them. We have remoted the responsibility of extensions so that the interface by which the Visual Studio editor speaks to an extension can happen locally or cross processes. The C# extension for Visual Studio Code, which is a headless, non-UI'd extension, is installed in Linux and listening on a port that we are then talking to.
Oh, okay. So that makes sense to me. However, where is that mapping being managed? Like, how are we creating that mapping at the binary level? Like, is there like a fixed, essentially, key namespace for like a C# executable that is being called in like from Visual Studio Code, and then that triggers like?
Yeah, there's a well-known port that the Visual Studio Code server runs on, and all communication runs over that. And because we started on that context, the VS Code server started running here, WSL server.sh. We passed in some port. I'd have to go digging for the port. You get the idea.
Yeah, no, I think I get it. So how would this work? Would this work invisibly for something like WebStorm?
WebStorm would have to speak the Visual Studio Code server protocol.
Right. So I can imagine there being
the architecture. They can copy the architecture.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So to be clear, I'm pretty sure that the Visual Studio Code team wants you to use Visual Studio Code. If WebStorm wanted to copy the architectural style, there's nothing preventing them from doing it, and everything I'm showing you is open source 100%. Is that cool?
Yeah, no, but I could see this being a good thing to even put in people's backlog, like as in like, hey, this is something we like WebStorm. You probably want to support this, right? Like
yes, it proves that it can happen. So then, if I start typing this, when I hit dot, that right there, that was a cross operating system call. because the painting and the work happened locally, but the language service is remoted. The language service exists in another process. Okay.
I think what's blowing my mind is just the layers of architecture and convention that needs to be put in place in order for all of this to work seamlessly, right? Like there's a very strong foundation of stuff that is enabling, I think, like all of this proxying and sharing and splitting and whatnot, right? Like,
I would gently propose that there's less here than you would think, because it was already making cross processes calls. It was just a matter of moving it from a Windows process talking to a Windows process to a Windows process talking to a Linux process that exists in the same port namespace. And that may be one of the confusions, because we do something tricky here. If we go back up here and I say make dir amal web, and we're going to go and make a web version of your application, and that's going to listen on localhost 5000. Localhost 5000 within the context of Linux is port 5000, right? In this VM. This VM has its own localhost. Like, are we localhost to Windows? Or are we localhost to, what is localhost anyway, right? That sounds like something that two stoners would like, wait, man, what is localhost anyway, dude? In this context here, oh, I have to reset my SSL certs. Let me try it on another port.
Scott, that would be stoners or Scott Hanselman.
Yeah, maybe.
Like,
Maybe me drinking a
because you also just asked that question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, drinking a caffeine-free Diet Coke, though.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Let me see why I'm getting an SSL error here. This SSL error happens sometimes. Let me just check real quick if I can prevent that from happening. I never remember why this happened. There's all this stuff where it tells you you're not supposed to do that, or you're not supposed to do this. Oh, you know what this might be? What's that thing called, my friends? HSTS cache clear. There's a thing in Chrome, and it's deep. There it is, net internals. And it's called domain security policy, localhost, delete. This might not work. Bear with me. I can never remember that. Point I was going to make was we automatically forward port 5000 from the inside of WSL to the outside. So if you look here, there's port 5000 locally on Windows, managed by this host process. So that layer, to everyone's point and Amal's question, is the thing that is allowing the VS Code server, which is run in Linux space, to forward a port outside of this world where localhost is still localhost. So then I can hit a breakpoint, hit F5 in Windows, fire up .NET Core in Linux, and now I'm at a breakpoint with a watch window and a call stack. Isn't that cool? Works with Node, works with everything. Okay, so here's, if I'm blowing your mind already, this is great because I got more. Check this out. Let's go and do this. Docker images. Do I have Docker running? I do. Cool. So I'm in Linux, and I'm going to say Docker images. Docker on Windows has historically sucked. And that's because in order to get Docker, which is fundamentally a Linux thing, to work on Windows, you needed a Linux VM, and you would go and spin up a Linux VM inside of Hyper-V, and you'd have to do this weird dance where you were putting a Linux VM on puppet strings and using it as the host for your Linux containers. Instead, the Docker for Windows folks, in conjunction with working with us, we've come up with a solution where you can just install Docker on Windows, and you go in here and you integrate it with WSL, and you say, I want these two Dockers to use my other Docker instance. If this was really Ubuntu or Linux, right, when I said down here, Docker context ls, and you see my standard default Docker endpoint. Hey, buddy, I'm doing a thing. Okay. Can you bring me a soda? Thank you, sir. Sorry, that's the 12-year-old. Okay. This Docker instance here thinks that it's talking to a Docker that's, nearby. But remember before when we did this? Thank you, friend. Hey, dude, put a shirt on, man. Get out of here. Oh, my goodness. Sorry. What was I doing? Oh, yeah, WSL-list-v. Look. Docker has its own hidden WSL instance that it used to host all of its Docker containers. But you'll notice it doesn't appear here in the terminal because you wouldn't want to be opening that one up. It's a Docker managed Linux. But that allows me then to go and Docker stuff whenever I want to. And that's super powerful. So what that means is I could go over to Windows again, go to my podcast website, which is, where is it? GitHub, there it is. And I've got like Docker run and Docker test. These are PowerShell scripts. I'm just going to go and say Docker test. And now that is going to go and build using the .NET Core SDK and pulling layers and doing all the Dockery stuff that I would want to do. And assuming, of course, I don't have .NET on my machine, it would do the build inside Docker. It's going to do a multi-layered build with this SDK. There you go. Just got the newest image. Now it's finished the build. Now it's doing a restore. It's going to go and even run my Selenium tests and everything, all within the context of Docker on Linux, which is super clean and easy and fun to use. And what's cool about this is that we've actually got now in Visual Studio proper the ability to run and debug directly in Docker or WSL2. So if somebody has a Docker workflow and they just want to hit F5 and start debugging and do their thing in Visual Studio Code, they can. There we go. I just built that whole thing, and now I'm running a test on it. And that's running the same Docker that I run in Windows is the same one that I'm running here. So if I Docker ps-a, here are my Docker containers running in Linux, because it's the same Docker. There's my podcast test happening right there. Now this opens up something really, really interesting if I want to start developing more easily. Let's say that I just hired Amal to come work at the company, and it's like, hey, go and set your computer up, and it's a whole thing, right? I'm going to set up your computer, and here's a Word document with all the crap you need to install. It's like a day of setting up, right? Well, what if I just said, here's the folder, run Visual Studio Code? Well, start up Visual Studio Code, and it's like, okay, here's some Go code. That's cool. That's only going to go install a bunch of crap. I don't want to install a bunch of crap. And it says, hey, this folder has a dev container in it. Do you want to open this as a container? All right, cool. Look in the lower left-hand corner, opening remote. Watch the terminal. We're taking that VS Code server, we're just running a script, and then we're loading it up the same exact way we did before. Here's your ports and stuff. All right. Now we've gone and installed Go language support into this dev container. I want to point out, this is my Windows machine. I do not have Go on this computer. I have no Go code, no Go SDK, no Go anything. But I have given Amal a dev container file with a list of extensions that her Visual Studio Code would need, and a Docker file that installs Go and the tools we use here at the company. Sets them all up. So then I can go back here and I get IntelliSense, and my builds, my tests, and my language services run in the context of the Docker container.
Oh my God. I first of all, I'm so mind blown by this, but also I want to talk with you offline, or maybe we can podcast about it or something, but like, I want to talk to you about how to you actually take this pattern and like use it across the board, like with Linux and Mac OS as well. Like I think it's extremely a very productive pattern for getting folks like onboarded easily, right?
Yeah. This should work on Mac too. Let me show you this. So then, what if I did this? Okay, blah, blah, blah. Put in let's see if I can spell my last name right. I'm going to log into online.visualstudio.com. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go and start up a VM. I'm in Chrome, or I'm actually in Edgeium. I'm in Chrome right here. It's firing up a VM in the cloud. And I can go and make these as much as I want, right? So I can make them for whatever, per second billing, blah, blah, blah. I could go and say create code space, and I want to have a Linux machine with 16 gigs of RAM or whatever I want. And now look, this is Visual Studio Code, again, except I'm in the browser. And now I've got a full .NET application, and it just synced in my my themes. I've got Git installed, and then I can go and even open up my terminal. I'm in the cloud right now in this folder. So that means I don't even need them all to have Docker on a machine. I just point her to a URL, and she's now running my app in a full Visual Studio Code. But that's cool. What if I just wanted to literally have it run even faster and not in the browser? We could go and say, I'm going to open this in VS Code proper. So then I'll come back over here. Now I'm in an actual instance of Visual Studio Code, not the browser. I'll then connect to that remote code space. So now I'm not connected to WSL. I'm not connected to Docker. I'm connected to a code space in the cloud with full terminal support and all the stuff that I want, and as much power as I feel like paying for. Isn't that yummy? Huh, friends? Who loves you? Shiny.
Awesome thought.
Sweet.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. The problem is people don't look at this stuff because Microsoft with a $sign.
Well, I think, Scott, what's really interesting for me, like I'm having a little bit of a reflective moment, as you can tell, as my mind is being blown, my realities are being questioned, I think, I know, right? I think what's so interesting for me is, like, software is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Servers, we have more services now. Like we have thicker clients. We have thicker bigger data, right? Like ultimately, like code as infrastructure as code came out of a need, right? Like it came out of like the need to repeat and automate and scale and have resilience. And for me, like the next evolution I see across the board with infrastructure as code is like really kind of streamlining that developer onboarding experience and and just like full kind of adoption of Dockerization across the board, right? Because you need an easy way to just push a change and have all your developers functional with no downtime, because it's super expensive to do anything else. So it's just, really
the part that I find amazing is I'm just one person, right? Imagine if I'm running a company.
I know.
And look at this. I've got a freaking global dashboard. I'm old enough to remember, because I'm hella old, when this was not free. And it's look, I got a dashboard. I can look at my uptime, my reliability, my responsiveness of my global load balanced system across multiple servers. Of course, it's going to embarrass me because there it is. I can see my processor utilization, all this stuff across multiple servers. I can push this stuff. I can control my billing. I can set budgets and see when I went over them. All of this as one human. I have it the idea that one person, I have multiple CI/CD pipelines for all of Hanselman Incorporated, like it's a real company with real people and stuff like that. It's crazy. I even made it so I can go to like my podcast, and at the very bottom, I show the version of .NET that's running, the commit that it's running on, and I can click on it and go directly to the build of that version. It's like I know what's going on, and I'm just one person. It makes me sad that there's still people like working out there at like Little Debbie Snack Cakes IT department. They're just zipping source code up and emailing it to their friends. You know, not to pick on them. I mean, they're lovely people, but I'm just saying that like the maturity level that is possible as one individual right now with the cloud and the free tools we have available versus the maturity level of software that is happening in enterprises all over the world is a pretty far distance there. Why is this costing so much? What am I doing?
I mean, we have a long way to go to like bridge that gap, but I think that's where like advocacy comes into play, and I think the work that you're doing is like kind of fills that mission, right?
I appreciate that, because my goal is to tell people what you can do for cheap. Like here, I'm actually wondering, like my wife is going to be pissed because I hit over 150 this month. So I would have to go and figure out like where the money's coming from. I'm actually running 20 different websites on this system. So there's actually more going on here than you would think. I have 20 different separate websites all shoved into one containered system. And I'm just wondering about my cost analysis now because it's, here we go. Where's my money? Unknown. I gotta go figure out, like that's a VM and that's a VM. Yeah, see, you can see all my stuff here, hanselman.com. Exactly what it costs to run my blog and my stuff. I have to figure out what the hell unknown is. Anyway, I'll do that later. Cool. Any other questions, my friends? Let me look in the chat. To John.
Yes, I guess the Linux distros you installed have no UI, but can you install a UI on top of that?
That is a lovely question, and I thank you for it. In fact, WSL Gui Support was launched at Microsoft Build. We're going to make it automatic and easy, so you're literally going to be able to. Can I help you, sir? My love? People are here. Would you put a shirt on, sir? Do you have shoes? Are you feral? Would you put on some clothes, my love? No, you're on YouTube right now, so run away. Thank you, sir. Okay, bye-bye. There we go. GUI support for Linux. So here's Windows 10 running the GNOME Explorer alongside Outlook. So Google for it. You can do it now, but we will have full support for that later this fall. That means whatever Linux makes you happy. You can also use we also are going to expose the GPU via CUDA. So you're going to be able to do TensorFlow on Linux on Windows natively.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah. Isn't that fun? Say what you will, but Windows is it sucks less.
Well, the world has changed, Scott. I've contributed to projects like Web Platform Tests, and like the conversations you see happen where like an engineer from Mozilla is teaching an engineer from like on Edge about how to do a release on Chromium. Like these are things that are like were like unfathomable, like 10 years ago, like in the height of the browser wars, right? So like clearly and I think like Microsoft embracing open source, for better or worse, embracing open source is, I think, a step in the right direction here for, I think, kind of like breaking these unnecessary, breaking these unnecessary silos between operating systems, right?
Yeah.
So.
Oh, one other thing I want to say. I think most of our folks on the call here are probably Windows people, or maybe 80% are. But I like the Windows UI. Okay, like I'm non-denominational. I've been doing software for 30 years. I've worked on Unix machines. I've got Macs around the house here. I'm Team iPhone. I mean, I'm non-denominational. Whatever religion you're excited about, you love your religion. I think that's great. I'm not trying to convert anybody. But Windows itself, the Windows experience, the way Windows does windowing, I like. I like the option of being able to do hotkeys, which I think are better on Windows than they are on Mac. We're improving those features a lot. We've added now a launcher, much like Spotlight. So on Windows, you have Windows Power Toys, so I can just go like that and run stuff. So if there's things that are keeping you on other operating systems, that you just can't survive unless you have this or have that, we got all that stuff. We really, really do. I would encourage people to give Windows an extra look. But if you just want to come in here, hit Alt, Alt Enter, and just go and do your thing and stay in Bash. And we've also got what's the word? We can split. I can do this like what is this called? Not tmux, but I can do tmux. But split panes, multiple split pane stuff. Like you can make Windows your own place is kind of what I'm trying to say. So I've got Linux on the one side, and I've got Windows on the other side. I forgot my binding for that. Is it Shift Alt D? There it is. Look at that. So DOS over here, Vim over here, and this is all within the context of not using tmux. This is just using the terminal. Oh, Tijan says, how did you customize the prompt? Go and Google for Hanselman Pretty Prompt. They did a whole article about that. How to set up your fonts exactly this way you want to make it happy. I've also got a YouTube channel I would like to just get everyone on. You could really do me a solid. I can make dozens of dollars on YouTube with the YouTube kids. I've even started doing the whole make a stupid face thing. I just did this yesterday. I think I want to see if more people will click on it if I make a dumb face. I did a blog post or a video rather on how to do git push. I also have one, to your point, to John, how to customize the Windows terminal. I did a video on that as well, so you can check that out.
Does it show us how to add custom background?
Yeah. So actually, let me show you this. Hanselman animated GIF prompt. Just put Hanselman in front of everything that you do, and you'll get better search results. I actually went and I did this. I made reaction GIFs to builds. So if you look here, this is me building a .NET application, and I get an error. So then I have a GIF when I come back with an error level 1, and then I fix it, and then I come back, and then I have a GIF when I get it right.
That's good.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can do whatever makes you happy.
We might just have a whole new generation of developers that's excited about developing now that you have GIFs and Terminal.
It's super easy because when you're going to Terminal, and actually I'm trying to figure out what I wanted to change it. Like this is my settings in Terminal. I haven't actually set the background in this one yet. Let me see. Is this the one here? PowerShell? Which one am I in? PowerShell. Okay, so PowerShell is 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it's this one. So then I could go and say use acrylic true. Why is that not? I wanted to see acrylic. Acrylic is the word that they use for being see-through. And I'm supposed to be able to set the opacity. Acrylic opacity. But I'm not seeing it go transparent. I have to go and debug that. I don't know why. Let me try. I've got 2 terminals actually.
Do you need to like read from source or something?
No, so that's good that you mentioned that, because in fact, Windows Terminal prides itself very much on its ability to read things back directly without you having to do anything. So for example, if I'm in PowerShell right now, which is here, I can go and say font size. If I'm right, I can just change that and it will like remount. See, now you're making me feel like maybe I'm editing the wrong file. Terminal goes out of its way to allow you to change. There it is. See how I can make a change? I just hit save and it picks it up automatically. Something is preventing my background from happening. Let's try background image. And then I've got a special Dropbox that I share with my friend Francesca. We call it Reference, and it's animated GIFs. And she and I dump all of our animated GIFs into one Dropbox. So that would be in the Dropbox Reference Animated GIFs, which is in the context of this file needs to be // // that's not background image. There you go. Background image opacity 0.4. What I'm not seeing is my acrylic, which is what I wanted to see, which is making this. See, Control Scroll does this. Control Shift Scroll changes opacity, but in this context, it's not. Control. Oh, so Tom is having a conversation here about how to get updated. In the fall, we will make it so you don't need to install anything, but we actually did recently move the kernel, the Linux kernel, out. So we are requiring a single download for that. But this fall, we'll make it automatic, and the Linux kernel that we ship will be coming down via Windows Update. But the issue is, this is a little known fact about Windows. There's Windows Update, and then there's a thing called Microsoft Update. And Microsoft Update has to be turned on explicitly. Receive updates from other Microsoft products. Excuse me. And internally, we call them WOO and MOO, Windows Update and Microsoft Update. Historically, the Linux kernel lived in Windows Update, but if you think about it for a second, that's a bad idea because it's not Windows. So it should be a part of the Microsoft Update. That'll be done this fall, and so that's why there's that extra step there, Tom. What I was going to do really quickly was, because I have a bug here, Windows Terminal Control Shift Scroll Opacity. I was going to go and see if this was on their website. There we go. Control Shift Scroll should enable terminal if it's not on already. Blah, blah, blah. Use acrylic equals true in the profile. Acrylic is disabled on inactive Windows. That's interesting. And what's cool about this is all, like, you can read about this stuff. If you find a bug or have a conversation, like, there's whole discussions about these things. Windows Terminal actually has a preview version and a regular version. So I've got the Windows Terminal, and then I have the preview side by side, which is vNext. So if you want, you can go and see the vNext version of the Windows Terminal. I'm wondering, I wanted to go figure out why that opacity is not working. Ah, that's awesome. That's stupid. Anyway, it's kind of fun. Get rid of that, hit save, gone. Oh yeah, Mohammed, I'm pointing out this here. That's coming soon. So yeah, lots of different things you can do. Oh, plus to the Amal's question of, do I have to like reload the JSON file? In fact, you can script the JSON file and write to it. It'll pick up the change. So if you wanted to change the color of a tab when a build failed to make it blink red or whatever, you could do that too as well. Well, I am running out of gas, so I think I'm going to take a nap. Any other questions, my friends?
Someone asked about the annotation tools that you use.
Oh, I am using Zoomit from Sysinternals. So if I go to my podcast, for example, and I zoom in, I can hold down Control and Shift and go like this. I can hold down Control and Alt and go like this. I can press R for red, Y for yellow, B for blue, G for green, and then when I hit escape, it goes away. So then I can go like this. Cool. Awesome. Sweet. Bummer. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, Scott, thank you so much for such a not only thorough overview. I can't believe we covered the amount of stuff that we did in the time that we did, but I think just for the enthusiasm and just also like continued push for inclusivity in software design and accessibility. So thank you.
Super cool, Scott. I'm glad that I did recorded this session because, like everyone, I might have to go and see it again.
Yeah, I was a little caffeinated, I think. But I appreciate that. Thank you, both of you, for the compliments. I just think there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in the world right now, and I think that Microsoft is doing a medium job of telling people about it, about the decidedly cool and non-evil things that we're doing. I just think I wish I had these things, and to Amal's point, it makes things just better for people. If you're a student and you have an old Dell laptop, add a little RAM to it, put on WSL, go to town. Python, Node. Windows is the best developer laptop once you get these couple things set up. My goal right now is to make it so WSL installation is like falling off a log. Right now, it's about 3 or 4 steps in a reboot. I'm going to make it 1 step in a reboot. And then Visual Studio Code. Once you get Visual Studio Code, it should set you up for success. Mm-hmm. And it actually does that now. It'll notice, oh, you're running Go. Do you need this extension? Or, oh, you launched me within WSL. So make sure you go up to my YouTube. Oh, and if you want to see something really fun, I'm not sure, Amal and I follow each other on Twitter. She may have seen this. You also take a look. What I did was there's a guy on Twitter named Ifeanyi Ekochukwu, and he called me and he's like, yeah, I gotta use Linux for work. And it was like, crap, I gotta use Windows for work rather. And I was like, dude, let me call you and let me record it. And he's like, okay. And he shared his screen, and in 45 minutes, and he's not the same as me. He wants NVim, and he wants Tmux, and he wants Go and Python and the stuff he wants. In 45 minutes, we set him up from scratch on his gaming PC, and we turn it into a developer PC. And he's a hardcore Mac head. And this is not scripted. My buddy called me and we did a thing. And it was pretty hilarious because he's asking questions and we're setting up fonts and stuff. And he's like, that's ugly. I don't like that. I would do this, do that. Should check that out.
Yeah, I would imagine that workflow combined with something like publicly available .dot files, right? Like yeah. it just kind of allows any Windows machine to just be your machine, and that's kind of cool.
It's funny.
It's a big shift for developers to have that kind of I would say that kind of friendliness and or just like ease of use with Windows machines, right? Like that's.
It's interesting that you mentioned .dot files, because if you go over here to the online Visual Studio Codespace place and you click .dot files, if you keep your .dot files in a repository, when we make a development environment for you in the cloud, we'll bring your .dot files down. So that's becoming a thing now, right? You carry them around from job to job and you want them to come with you. So then you can go and set up a repository, an install command, to get your system the way you want it. So .dot files definitely are a good idea. Good point. Oh, and by the way, I thought that I was sharing my screen when I was talking about that video. I failed to do that. It was this video here called How to Set Up a Windows 10 Machine. Can we convert a diehard Mac head? And I put that in the chat. So check that out. That was very interesting because I don't do Vim and Tmux, and he did, so we had to learn together. But and this is a Windows machine, and I think the other thing I want to point out, and I hope that you all get this now, that, yeah, if you want to just dual boot and run Linux, that's great. That's fine. But it's a different thing. This isn't that. This is containers and seamlessly moving back and forth between file systems. And piping the ls output to clip.exe, like that's not a thing that Linux does. And it's not I just ran a VM. It's a level of integration, and it blurs the lines between operating systems more than I think people are used to seeing. Okay, my wife is wondering where I'm at now. I gotta go.
Sounds good.
Well, on behalf of the user group, Scott, I can't thank you enough for your time. This has been fantastic. So thank you again.
That's my pleasure. Appreciate it.
I'm gonna stop recording and just give me a second.